Ladies and gentlemen, there's a sound that calls to us, louder than any distraction, more powerful than any fear, and more urgent than any problem we're facing. It's the voice of God, and in the midst of the noise, the chaos, and the relentless rush of life, that voice is still speaking. But here's the question: are you listening? It's easy to get caught up in the daily grind, the pressure, the stress, the constant barrage of notifications, opinions, and demands. But in the middle of all that noise, God is still trying to speak to you. He's trying to lead you, guide you, and give you direction, but it's up to you to tune in. You don't have to let the noise drown out his voice. You don't have to keep chasing after answers in the wrong places. You just need to position yourself to hear what he's saying. You need to lean in and recognize that God is not just speaking to your circumstances. He's speaking to your heart, to your soul, and to your purpose. So today, let's silence the distractions for a moment. Let's open our hearts and ask God, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Let's discover together how we can hear his voice in the middle of life's noise. In life, we often find ourselves overwhelmed by noise, the noise of our own thoughts, the voices of others, and the relentless hum of the world around us. It's in this chaotic environment that the voice of God calls to us. But the question is, can we hear it? The truth is, God's voice isn't always loud or dramatic. It's not often a still, small whisper that cuts through the clutter of our lives. The challenge is not that God is not speaking, but that we may not always be able to recognize his voice in the midst of everything else. Understanding how God speaks to us is the first step toward learning to hear him more clearly. The Bible teaches us that God speaks in many different ways. He speaks through scripture, through prayer, through other people, and through the circumstances of our lives. However, we must learn to discern his voice from all the other voices that compete for our attention. Just because we hear something doesn't mean it's the voice of God. There are many other sources of noise: our own desires, our fears, the influence of others, and even the enemy trying to lead us astray. To recognize the voice of God, we must first understand the nature of his communication. One of the most fundamental aspects of God's voice is that it aligns with his character. God is always consistent with who he is. He is loving, patient, merciful, and full of grace. His voice will never lead us into fear, confusion, or division. His words will always point us toward truth, even if that truth is difficult to hear. God's voice is not meant to condemn us, but to call us higher, to lead us into a deeper relationship with him, and to fulfill the purpose he has for our lives. Often God speaks through a sense of peace, a deep inner knowing, or a quiet nudge in our spirit. This inner peace is different from the fleeting relief or comfort that the world offers. It's a peace that transcends understanding, one that remains steady even when circumstances are uncertain. When God speaks, there's an inner confirmation that what we're hearing is true and right. It's not an overwhelming feeling or a loud voice from the sky, but a subtle peace in the heart that confirms his will. One of the key ways to recognize God's voice is through the Bible. The Bible is God's written word to us, and it contains the principles and truths that guide our lives. When we know the Bible, we can better recognize God's voice, as his spoken word will never contradict what is already revealed in Scripture. God's voice will always lead us to align our actions and decisions with the truth found in his word. If what we are hearing does not align with Scripture, it's a strong indication that it may not be the voice of God. Another powerful way God speaks is through prayer. Prayer is not just about asking God for things, it's also about listening to his voice. In the quiet moments of prayer, we can often hear God speaking to our hearts. It may come as a thought or a prompting that feels different from our own ideas. Prayer provides an opportunity to still our minds and open our hearts to God's leading. It's in this space that we are often able to hear God's voice more clearly as we make ourselves available to listen. In addition to personal moments of reflection, God often speaks through the people around us. Sometimes he uses others to deliver messages of encouragement, correction, or direction. These can come from pastors, friends, family members, or even strangers who speak a word that resonates deeply within us. While not every word spoken by others will be from God, it's important to discern whether a message aligns with what God has already been speaking to our heart. God's voice can often be confirmed through the wise counsel of those who share our faith and understand God's will. Sometimes God speaks through the circumstances of our lives. While not every challenge or setback is a direct message from God, he can use the situations we face to reveal his will. For example, a closed door might be God's way of redirecting us, while an open door could be his way of affirming his plan for us. It's important to pay attention to the events that happen around us and ask God what he might be trying to show us. When we're able to interpret our circumstances through the lens of God's truth, we can recognize his voice speaking through them. It's important to note that God's voice is often gentle and humble. In a world that is constantly shouting for our attention, God does not force his way into our lives. He doesn't demand that we listen to him, but instead invites us to hear him, to draw near and to understand his heart. This is why it's so crucial that we take time to silence the noise around us and create space to hear his voice. If we're constantly running from one thing to the next, if we're never still, we'll miss the quiet, gentle whisper of God. One of the most common struggles people face when trying to recognize God's voice is distinguishing between their own desires and God's will. We all have hopes, dreams, and emotions that influence our decisions. These desires are not inherently wrong, but they can sometimes cloud our ability to hear God clearly. In order to recognize God's voice, we must first learn to distinguish his desires for us from our own. This requires humility and a willingness to surrender our own plans to God. When we approach God with an open heart and a willingness to submit to his will, we position ourselves to hear his voice more clearly. Another challenge to hearing God's voice is the issue of timing. Sometimes we may recognize that God is speaking, but we struggle with understanding the timing of his message. God does not always speak in a way that fits our timetable. His plans are often bigger and more complex than we can understand, and his timing is always perfect. We may feel frustrated when we don't hear what we want to hear, or when we don't hear it when we want to hear it. But God's timing is never wrong. It's in his perfect timing that his voice becomes the most powerful in our lives. Ultimately, recognizing God's voice is about building a relationship with him. The more time we spend with God, the more familiar we become with the way he speaks. Just like any other relationship, the more we know him, the more we can recognize his voice. This comes through prayer, reading scripture, worship, and living in community with other believers. As we grow in our relationship with God, our ability to recognize his voice becomes sharper and clearer. It's a journey that requires patience, practice, and a willingness to listen. In a world full of noise, God's voice is the one we need to hear most. It is the voice that leads us into truth, into peace, and into purpose. It's the voice that can guide us through life's challenges, that can provide comfort in times of sorrow, and that can inspire us to live boldly for his kingdom. But we must be intentional about listening for it. We must be willing to quiet the noise around us, to tune our hearts to his voice and to respond when he calls. When we do, we will find that his voice is always there, always speaking, and always ready to lead us to the life he has planned for us. In the noise and rush of modern life, it's often hard to hear anything clearly, let alone the voice of God. The world around us is constantly vying for our attention, and it's easy to become distracted, overwhelmed, and even disconnected from the stillness that is required to hear God's voice. The truth is, to hear God clearly, we must first choose to tune out the distractions, eliminate the noise, and create space for him to speak. This process of tuning out the noise is one of the most challenging but necessary steps in hearing God's voice. Distractions come in many forms. They could be the responsibilities of daily life, the constant flow of information through social media, or the never-ending demands of work, family, and personal goals. These distractions aren't inherently bad, but when they take precedence over listening to God, they can drown out His voice. The constant clamor of life can create a sense of busyness and urgency that prevents us from sitting in silence, reflecting, and hearing the quiet whispers of God. The first step in tuning out the noise is recognizing how pervasive these distractions are in our lives. Most of the time, we don't even realize how much noise we've allowed in. We wake up to the buzz of our phones, immediately scroll through messages, emails, and social media posts, and start our day with our minds already cluttered. Our attention is fragmented between work tasks, personal concerns, and external demands, leaving little room for quiet contemplation or connection with God. In many ways, we've become conditioned to live in this constant state of noise and activity, believing that we need to be constantly busy to feel productive or relevant. One of the most powerful ways to tune out the noise is through the practice of prayer. Prayer is not just about speaking to God, it's about listening to Him as well. Often we approach prayer as a one-sided conversation where we present our requests, thoughts, and concerns to God. Well, that's an important aspect of prayer. True communication with God involves both speaking and listening. In our prayer time, we must make space for silence, allowing God the opportunity to speak to us. Sometimes the best prayer is not a string of words, but a simple posture of listening, being open to whatever God might want to reveal. Worship is also a powerful tool for tuning out the noise. When we enter into worship, whether through music, praise, or simply acknowledging God's greatness, we shift our focus from ourselves and our surroundings to Him. Worship realigns our hearts and minds, helping us to tune out the distractions of the world. When we focus on God's goodness, His majesty, and His love, we position ourselves to hear from Him more clearly. Worship brings us into a place of reverence and awe, where we are no longer preoccupied with the noise of our lives, but fully attentive to the presence of God. Technology is one of the biggest distractions of our time. With constant access to information, entertainment, and social media, it can be incredibly challenging to tune out the noise. Notifications are designed to grab our attention, pulling us away from the present moment and filling our minds with a constant stream of thoughts and stimuli. However, in order to hear God's voice, we must intentionally disconnect from these distractions. This might mean setting aside specific times during the day to put our phones down, turn off the TV, or step away from the computer. It may involve setting boundaries with social media or using technology in a way that serves our spiritual health rather than contributing to the noise. Distractions aren't just external, they can also be internal. Our minds are often filled with worries, anxieties, doubts, and concerns that make it hard to focus on God's voice. These mental distractions can drown out the clarity of God's direction. In such case, the practice of mindfulness and focusing on the present moment can be incredibly helpful. Learning to bring our attention to the here and now, being mindful of what God is doing in the present, can help quiet our racing thoughts and create space for God's voice to be heard. It's important to remember that eliminating distractions doesn't mean isolating ourselves from the world or avoiding responsibilities. It's about intentionally creating space to listen. Just like tuning a radio to the right frequency, we must adjust our hearts and minds to the right frequency to hear God. This requires intentionality and discipline. It's easy to let the noise take over, but we must choose to prioritize time with God above everything else. This doesn't mean we stop living our daily lives or ignore our duties. It means that we make time to listen to God in the midst of it all. Ultimately, tuning out the noise is a process of surrender. It's about acknowledging that without God's direction, we are lost in the chaos. We must surrender our need for constant activity, our desire for control, and our attachment to the distractions that pull us away from God's voice. When we surrender, we make space for God to speak, and we allow his voice to be the loudest sound in our lives, guiding us through the noise and helping us find clarity and peace. It's important to note that this process is not always easy or instantaneous. In fact, it often requires sustained effort and commitment. There will be days when the noise feels deafening, when the distractions feel overwhelming, and when it seems impossible to hear God's voice. But even in those moments, God is still speaking. The key is to persist in creating space, to continue tuning out the noise, and to trust that as we do, we will hear God's voice more clearly. With time, practice, and patience, we can learn to tune out the distractions and tune into the voice of God that is always there, always speaking, and always leading us toward his will. When it comes to hearing God's voice, many of us long for clarity. We desire a clear, unmistakable direction, a word from God that we can act on without hesitation. However, there is a crucial step that many of us overlook or fail to fully embrace. Responding with action. It's not enough to simply hear God's voice. We must also act on what he is saying. The Bible makes it clear that obedience is an essential part of following God's will. Hearing God is not just a passive experience. It requires an active response. When God speaks, he expects us to move in faith, to align our actions with his word, and to trust that he will guide us every step of the way. Too often, we fall into the trap of hearing God's voice, but hesitating to respond. We may feel that we are not ready, that we need more confirmation, or that we need to understand everything before we take the first step. While it's natural to want assurance, God doesn't always give us all the details up front. His call often comes in the form of an invitation to step out in faith, with the understanding that he will provide direction as we go. This is where many people get stuck, waiting for perfect clarity or a perfect set of circumstances before they act. But God doesn't operate that way. He wants us to trust him enough to take the first step, even when the path ahead isn't fully clear. The story of Abram provides a powerful example of responding to God's call with action. In Genesis 12, God tells Abraham to leave his homeland, his family, and everything he knows to go to a land that God will show him. At that moment, God doesn't give Abraham all the details of where he's going or how it will unfold. He simply says, "Go to the land I will show you." Abraham's response wasn't to ask for more details or delay his obedience until he felt more comfortable. Instead, he responded with action. He packed up his family and went, trusting that God would lead him every step of the way. Abraham didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew enough to take God at his word and step out in faith. This kind of obedience is what God desires from us as well. When he speaks, he wants us to move even when we don't have all the answers. One of the challenges we face in responding with action is overcoming fear and doubt. We often wonder if we're hearing God correctly or if we're misinterpreting his voice. We may fear making mistakes or stepping out in faith only to discover we were wrong. It's important to remember that God is a loving Father and he understands our fears. He doesn't expect us to have it all figured out. He simply asks that we trust him and obey. The act of responding with action is an act of faith, not perfection. It's about trusting that God's guidance will be sufficient, even if we don't know everything in advance. Jesus often encourages followers to take steps of faith, even when the situation seemed uncertain. In Matthew 14, when Peter stepped out of the boat to walk toward Jesus on the water, it was an act of faith. Peter didn't know exactly what would happen, but he trusted Jesus enough to take that first step. When we hear God's voice, he is calling us to take that same kind of step, one that requires faith, trust, and courage. Another reason we sometimes hesitate to act is the fear of failure. We may worry that if we respond to God's voice, things might not go as we expect, the outcome might not be what we hoped for, or we might face unexpected challenges along the way. But the reality is that failure is not the opposite of success. It's often part of the process. God uses our mistakes, our missteps, and our failures to teach us, refine us, and grow our faith. The Bible is filled with examples of people who made mistakes, but were still used by God to accomplish great things. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, yet he became one of the greatest leaders of the early church. Moses doubted his ability to lead the Israelites, but God used him to deliver his people from slavery. When we respond to God's voice in faith, even if we face setbacks or challenges, we can trust that he is working in and through us. It's not about achieving perfection. It's about being faithful to take the steps he calls us to take. In addition to overcoming fear and doubt, responding with action also involves a willingness to surrender control. Many of us like to be in control of our lives, and the thought of stepping into the unknown can be unsettling. But responding to God's voice requires us to let go of our need for control and trust that he knows what's best for us. Jesus exemplified this surrender when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." Jesus knew that the path before him was difficult, but he chose to surrender to the will of the Father. In the same way, when we hear God's voice, he calls us to surrender our plans and desires and trust that his plan is better. Surrender is not a passive act. It's an active choice to release our hold on our lives and allow God to take the lead. One of the most significant ways we can respond to God's voice is by acting in obedience to his commands. In John 14:15, Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commands." Obedience is an expression of our love for God. It's easy to say that we love God, but our love for him is demonstrated through our actions. When God speaks to us, he is not just offering advice or suggestions. He is giving us instructions for how to live according to his will. Our response should be one of obedience, even when it's difficult or goes against our natural inclinations. Obedience is not always easy, but it is always the path to blessing and fulfillment. Jesus promises that when we follow his commands, we will experience peace, joy, and the fullness of life that he offers. At times, responding with action requires stepping out of our comfort zones. God may call us to do things that challenge us or push us beyond what we think we are capable of. When Moses was called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he didn't feel qualified for the task. He was insecure about his abilities, and he even tried to make excuses. But God didn't call Moses because of his qualifications. He called Moses because he had a purpose for him. In the same way, God calls us to step out in faith, even when we feel unqualified or inadequate. When we respond with action, we are acknowledging that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. It's not about our abilities. It's about his strength working through us. Responding with action also involves trusting God with the outcome. Often we hesitate to act because we want to control the results. We want to know that everything will work out in our favor before we take a step. But God calls us to trust him, not just with our actions, but with the results. When we step out in faith, we don't know exactly how things will turn out, but we can trust that God will work everything for our good. Romans 8:28 assures us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This doesn't mean that everything will be easy or that we won't face challenges, but it means that God is with us in every circumstance and he will bring good from every situation. Finally, responding with action is an act of worship. When we obey God and act on what he has spoken, we are offering our lives as a living sacrifice to him. Romans 12:01 urges us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Our obedience is a form of worship that honors God and reflects our love and reverence for him. When we respond to God's voice, we are acknowledging that he is Lord over our lives and that we trust his plan. more than our own. In this way, our actions become an expression of our faith and our worship. Ultimately, responding with action is not just about doing things for God. It's about aligning our hearts and lives with His will. It's about moving in faith, trusting His guidance, and stepping out in obedience no matter the outcome. When we hear God's voice, we must respond. We must take action even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain. In doing so, we position ourselves to experience the fullness of His purpose and to live out the life He has called us to.